Shield and shackles, law for the 1% and the 99%. Shield and shackles, law for the 1% and the 99%. The wealthiest 1% are protected by the law but not bound by it. The bottom 99% are bound by the law but not protected by it. So goes a bitter aphorism circulating in our times, popularized by Professor Scott Galloway. Its words strike at the heart of a glaring paradox: the notion that the law, which ostensibly applies to all equally, in practice serves as armor for society's elites and as chains for everyone else. In the spirit of George Orwell's Animal Farm, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. The legal and political order has come to echo that satirical commandment. The question is not merely whether such inequality exists. History and daily reality resound with evidence that it does, but why and how it persists, and what it means for our understanding of justice, power, and freedom. The law is often personified as Lady Justice, blindfolded, impartial, holding balanced scales. In theory, it is the great equalizer, the same rules for the mighty and the meek. Yet lived experience reveals a more cynical portrait. The French writer Anatole France quipped over a century ago that the law, in its majestic equality, forbids the rich and poor alike to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal bread. His irony lays bare how formal equality can mask substantive injustice. The rich never need to sleep under bridges or steal bread, and so the law's prohibitions weigh only on the poor. The majestic equality of law thus often conceals a system that protects those who already have privilege while punishing those who do not. Law, morality, and religion, observed Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto, are too often so many bourgeois prejudices, behind which lurk in ambush just as many bourgeois interests. From a Marxian perspective, what we call the rule of law in a capitalist society is frequently the rule of the wealthy, dressing up their interests as universal principles. Histories of inequality, from Rome to feudalism to empire. This disparity between the protective and binding aspects of law is not a new development of modern capitalism. It is woven through the fabric of history. In ancient Rome, law and citizenship were tangled in hierarchy. Roman law afforded cives, citizens, privileges, and protections denied to slaves and provincials. A Roman patrician guilty of a crime might accept exile or pay a fine, while a lower-class person, or a slave, could face torture or crucifixion for a comparable offense. The famed principle, sedant arma togae, let arms yield to the toga, celebrated the rule of law, yet in practice the toga protected only the elite. The jus civile applied to citizens with full rights, whereas conquered peoples and the poor lived under a patchwork of decrees and brute force. The wealthy Roman, protected by status and patronage, could navigate around laws or influence their application. The common Roman was bound to obey, often without recourse. Roman justice literally had two tiers: for citizens, the right of appeal and more lenient punishments; for others, the capricious justice of provincial governors or masters. We see already the outline of a truth. The more status and wealth one had in Rome, the more the law served as a shield rather than a cage. Feudal Europe continued this pattern. One law for the lion and ox is oppression, wrote William Blake. And indeed, under feudal law, nobles and commoners did not face the same rules. Lords and barons lived by special privilege. The medieval concept of the benefit of clergy, or the right of nobles to be tried in peer courts, meant that gentry were effectively insulated from the harsher punishments that peasants suffered. A peasant poaching a deer to feed his family could be hanged for theft of the lord's game. while a nobleman who murdered that peasant might get off with a fine or a royal pardon. The bound were many: serfs tied to land, bound by feudal dues and manorial law, and the protected were few, a warrior aristocracy whose violence was licensed by divine right. Feudal law was open about its inequality. Privilegium literally means private law. What was legal or illegal depended on who you were. This era's laws bound the peasant in duties and corvée labor. But those same laws had loopholes wide enough for nobility to march through on horseback. Colonial regimes globalized this two-faced law. Under European empires, colonizers often exempted themselves from the rules they imposed on colonized peoples. In British India, British subjects were tried in separate courts, effectively protected by the law of the imperial power, and not bound by the local laws that Indians lived under. In French West Africa, the Code de l'Indigénat imposed draconian regulations and corvée on African subjects, while French citizens in the colonies basked in legal immunities. Colonial law operated on a dictum similar to that of Roman conquerors. For the colonizers, legal protection and rights; for the colonized, coercion and control. A telling historical image: the treaty ports of 19th-century China, where Europeans lived under the extraterritorial shelter of their home laws, untouchable by Chinese justice, even as Chinese people in their own land were subject to those same foreigners' dictates. The wealth and power of the colonizers put them beyond local law's reach. The bottom 99%, the colonized masses, were tightly bound by a complex of colonial edicts and taxes, yet not protected by any Bill of Rights or due process in the face of imperial violence. In the Belgian Congo, for example, millions of forced laborers had no legal shield from mutilation or death if they failed rubber quotas, while the European corporate agents enforcing these atrocities enjoyed near-total impunity. History thus offers a grim pattern. Law has often been a shield held by the powerful and a yoke fastened on the powerless. Law and power. Philosophical refractions. Great thinkers have grappled with this problem of law's double standard. Friedrich Nietzsche, with his characteristic venom, saw the state itself as an engine of domination, masquerading as the public good. "A state is called the coldest of all cold monsters," he wrote. "Coldly it lies, and this lie creeps from its mouth. I, the state, am the people. Whatever it saith, it lieth, and whatever it hath stolen." In Nietzsche's genealogy of morals, law and morality originate in the will to power. The strong impose their values and call it justice. The weak submit and call it virtue. Our legal ideals of equality and rights, in his view, often cloak a history of conquest and theft. The state's claim to embody the people is the lie of law's neutrality. Behind it stands the cold reality that law mostly serves those who can wield it as an instrument. Michel Foucault, a keen student of power's capillaries, would add that the law is but one form of social control among many. In Discipline and Punish, Foucault traces how, from the Enlightenment onward, explicit brute law, public executions, king's decrees, gave way to an invisible law of discipline in schools, factories, and prisons, a panoptic control. He described the modern prison as a panopticon, an architecture of unseen observers and perpetual surveillance designed to induce in the inmate a state of conscious and permanent visibility that assures the automatic functioning of power. In a sense, Foucault suggests that the binding force of law is internalized. Most of us obey not because a king threatens us, but because we have internalized the gaze of authority. Society's lower strata live under a vast network of surveillance and discipline. CCTV cameras on every housing project corner, police patrols in the high crime, red, impoverished neighborhoods, urine tests, and background checks for the wage laborer, while the wealthy glide from gated community to boardroom, largely unobserved and unpoliced. The panopticon's eye is cast downward. It is the poor, the parolee, the welfare applicant who feel the constant visibility, the need to demonstrate compliance. The rich man's discretions, behind mansion walls or offshore bank accounts, often escape that unforgiving light. This, too, is a modern way the 1% are not bound by the laws that constantly watch and bind the rest of us. For Hannah Arendt, the ultimate horror was to be cast outside the protection of the law altogether. In analyzing the plight of stateless refugees in the 20th century, Arendt coined the phrase, "the right to have rights." Basic human rights mean nothing, she observed, if one has no community or government willing to recognize and protect them. She noted that the stateless lived as people who lacked the very right to have rights, stripped of any legal status or recourse. One could argue that in a society of extreme inequality, the bottom 99% are not literally stateless, yet many effectively lack meaningful protection of the rights that exist on paper. When poor communities find no remedy from courts for polluted water or police abuse, when working people cannot afford to exercise their rights, like hiring a lawyer to defend against an eviction or wage theft, they have, in Arendt's sense, lost the effective right to have rights. They are citizens on paper, but not in practice, bound by laws that penalize them if broken, yet unshielded by laws that are supposed to guarantee housing, health, and equal treatment. The right to have rights phrase when equality before the law becomes a fiction. Theological perspectives, too, cast a stark light on earthly law's failures. St. Augustine, millennia ago, pronounced, "An unjust law is no law at all," implying that legality without justice has no true legitimacy. Martin Luther King, Jr., from a Birmingham jail, invoked that same maxim and asked us to recall that everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal, while the acts of the Hungarian freedom fighters were illegal. The implication is profound. Law divorced from justice is mere codified power. If the law protects only the rich and forsakes the poor, can we call it law in the moral sense at all? In the Judeo-Christian tradition, laws were given as tools to protect the widow, the orphan, the stranger, the most vulnerable. Ancient prophets railed against judges who took bribes and denied justice to the poor. The Hebrew Bible's vision of Jubilee, regular debt forgiveness and freedom for slaves, stands as a radical antithesis to our modern legal order that enforces debt contracts and permits the wealthy to exact interest endlessly from the poor. Divine law, in theory, embodies perfect justice and mercy, whereas human law often degenerates into an idol that serves the pharaohs and Caesars of the age. This theological critique aligns with secular radicals' view. When the law becomes a shield for Goliath and a snare for David, it betrays its own justification. The unprotected and the unheard. James Baldwin, reflecting on American racial injustice, gave voice to those systematically unprotected by the law. If one really wishes to know how justice is administered in a country, Baldwin wrote, one does not question the policemen, the lawyers, the judges, or the protected members of the middle class. One goes to the unprotected, those, precisely, who need the law's protection most, and listens to their testimony. If we follow Baldwin's advice and ask the marginalized, the homeless, the black or brown youth harassed under stop and frisk, the undocumented immigrant, the single mother evicted, what is their experience of the law? The answers paint a damning picture. These testimonies reveal that police and courts often treat the poor as a problem to be managed or punished, not as citizens to be safeguarded. The halls of justice for them may be better described as processing centers of control. A wealthy defendant, shielded by high-powered attorneys and public presumption of respectability, walks free on bail. A poor defendant, unable to post $500 bail, languishes in jail for months before trial. A suburban teenager caught with drugs gets a slap on the wrist or rehab. An inner-city teenager gets a criminal record. Neoliberal economies have eroded social safety nets, but doubled down on police and prisons. Thus, the law steps in not to protect the poor from misfortune, but to manage the fallout of poverty through criminalization. Here we see the sociology of control in action. The law in modern society provides a veneer of neutrality, even as it sorts people by class and race. Consider how vagrancy and loitering laws target the homeless simply for existing in public spaces, or how minor infractions, broken taillight, selling loose cigarettes, become gateways to violent encounters with law enforcement in poor neighborhoods. The affluent rarely face such intrusion in their lives. No one stops the billionaire in his limousine to ask for ID or harass him for standing on the sidewalk. The result is a deep distrust of the law among those who need its protection the most, and a kind of learned helplessness. Like Kafka's Joseph K., who finds himself arrested one morning for unknown charges and navigates a labyrinthine legal bureaucracy with no exit, the common person experiences the law as something perplexing, impersonal, and ultimately stacked against them. In Kafka's parable, Before the Law, a man from the countryside seeks the law's entry and is kept waiting a lifetime by a gatekeeper who never lets him in, only to learn as he dies that the door was meant solely for him, and now it will close. The masses knock at the doors of justice, yet gatekeepers, expensive procedures, bias, lack of standing, keep them outside. The promise of the law is dangled before them, yet its protections often remain just out of reach, reserved for those who already hold the keys. Neoliberalism and the rise of inequality. In recent decades, under neoliberal ideology, the gap between law's treatment of the wealthy and the rest has widened further. Neoliberalism preached free markets, deregulation, and limited government. Yet paradoxically, it required a strong legal regime to enforce the advantages of capital. The state didn't wither away. It pivoted to protect property and profit above all else. Starting in the late 20th century, we witnessed the deregulation of safeguards for workers and consumers, alongside the hyper-regulation of the poor, through punitive welfare rules, stricter policing, etc. Tax codes were rewritten with loopholes and cuts that benefit the richest 1%, while budgets for public defenders, legal aid, and social services for the 99% were slashed. The result is an environment where, as one commentator put it, "We have our own laws. We're protected by the law, but we're not bound by it." The rich person can effectively opt out of the failures of public systems by paying for private schools, private health care, private security, and even opt out of punishment by affording lawyers who ensure, for example, that tax evasion is reclassified as tax avoidance with a mere fine. Meanwhile, the rest are ever more tightly bound, subject to austerity, underfunded schools, and zero-tolerance policing. Economist Thomas Piketty's monumental research on inequality showed that wealth concentration in the 21st century is reaching levels last seen in the Gilded Age. The top 1% in the United States, for instance, now command roughly 20% of national income and 35% of wealth, and globally, the trends are similarly stark. An Oxfam report in 2023 highlighted that the richest 1% grabbed nearly two-thirds of all new wealth created since 2020, worth $42 trillion, almost twice as much as the bottom 99% of the world's population. This vast economic gap translates into political and legal power. Money talks, and it drafts legislation. With billions at their disposal, the wealthy fund armies of lobbyists to write laws and loopholes, and political campaigns to install friendly lawmakers and judges. In the U.S., for example, campaign finance rulings have declared money a form of speech, giving the affluent disproportionate influence over who gets elected and what laws are prioritized. The result? Regulatory agencies captured by the industries they're supposed to oversee, tax laws riddled with exemptions for capital income, and labor laws so weak that companies face little consequence for union busting or exploiting workers. Legal philosophy exalts the rule of law, but neoliberal reality often gives us rule by law, law harnessed to the service of private accumulation. As law and economics advocate and libertarian icon, Friedrich Hayek argued, the ideal was a government of laws, not men. Yet, ironically, under modern capitalism, that ideal is perverted. We have laws, yes, but laws largely written by and for a select group of men, and they are still mostly men, who own the commanding heights of the economy. In a neoliberal age, even crises become opportunities for unequal law. When the 2008 financial meltdown struck, who was bound and who was protected? Millions of ordinary people lost homes, jobs, and savings, and many faced the full brunt of the law if they missed mortgage payments or defaulted on debts. But the titans of finance, whose reckless speculation fueled the crisis, were bailed out by the state's legal financial apparatus or paid modest fines in comparison to the havoc caused. In the U.S., not a single top Wall Street CEO went to prison for frauds that collapsed the world economy. Instead, banks like HSBC that were caught laundering money for drug cartels received deferred prosecutions and fines equivalent to a few weeks' profits. A telling phrase emerged, "too big to jail." If an ordinary person steals, it's a crime. If a global bank steals or enables crime, it's a settlement, and no one sees a jail cell. The law bent like a willow to avoid binding the powerful, in stark contrast to its iron fist for the lowly. As the New Yorker reported, after 2008, federal prosecutors filed no criminal indictments against major banks or senior bankers related to the mortgage crisis. The system instead delivered what that article called velvet accountability for the rich. This double standard erodes any pretense that law is blind. Instead, it appears the scales of Lady Justice are rigged, heavily weighted on one side by gold: surveillance, capitalism, and technocratic dominion. An emergent layer to this inequality is technocratic power and surveillance capitalism, the new architecture of control in our digital age. Harvard professor Shoshana Zuboff has illuminated how corporations like Google and Facebook operate in a realm largely beyond traditional law, carving out a new frontier where personal data is the currency. In her words, surveillance capitalism feeds on every aspect of every human's experience, treating our private lives as free raw material for data extraction and behavior modification. Tech giants often move faster than regulations, exploiting legal gray areas. They persuade governments to adopt light-touch regulation with promises of innovation, all while they build unprecedented systems of surveillance and influence. Who is protected by these new quasi-legal norms? The handful of companies and owners at the top? Their rights to harvest data and profit are enshrined. And who is bound? Billions of users, quietly conscripted into being data sources, often without meaningful consent or legal recourse. Our online behavior is tracked, our preferences and vulnerabilities analyzed, then sold to the highest bidder or used to nudge our actions. The law lags behind or is crafted in consultation with these very firms. We end up with EULAs, end-user license agreements, and terms of service, private laws written by corporations, that bind users mightily. You clicked, "I agree," therefore you have almost no rights and cannot sue, while shielding the companies from liability. In effect, big tech often lives above the law, protected by weak regulation and Section 230 immunities, whereas the users are bound by an invisible code of algorithms and opaque policies that govern what they see and do. The specter of technocracy also appears in governance. Complex decisions handed off to unelected experts or algorithms. Consider predictive policing algorithms used in many cities, often proprietary systems developed by private companies. These algorithms, based on crime data, itself reflecting biased policing patterns, end up disproportionately sending police to poor and minority neighborhoods, reinforcing a cycle of surveillance and enforcement. The community subjected to this algorithmic scrutiny is bound by its predictions: more police stops, more arrests, yet they have no participation in or understanding of the code that labels them potential criminals. Meanwhile, white-collar crimes, which require more complex investigation, seldom get the algorithmic spotlight. The prison industrial complex and surveillance complex converge. Technology makes it easier to monitor and manage large populations of the disadvantaged through face recognition, GPS trackers on parolees, big data analysis of welfare recipients, a high-tech panopticon, while those at the top use technology to secure their castles, gated estates, encrypted communications, fleets of lawyers challenging any intrusion. We can imagine the trajectory of this technocratic law in speculative terms. Perhaps a future looms where AI systems become the de facto judges and gatekeepers. A credit algorithm decides who gets a loan or an apartment. A predictive algorithm flags individuals as risky to national security. A social media score, a la a dystopian social credit system, dictates one's access to services. In such a scenario, who do you think will design and tune these systems? The wealthy and powerful, of course, or those aligned with them. Bias in, bias out. If the data reflects historical inequities, the AI will enforce those inequities under a guise of scientific objectivity. A truly egalitarian AI might be possible in theory, but if current power dynamics persist, the algorithms will be just another way to encode "some are more equal than others." Consider the metaphor of a digital feudalism. Giant tech platforms as fiefdoms where we are the serfs. They offer convenient services, lands to work on, protection of a sort, but on their terms. They dictate the laws of their terrain, community guidelines, content moderation rules, which can ban a user or delete content without due process. The wealthy or influential can often get exceptions. Celebrity accounts get special treatment, powerful individuals can sometimes get content removed quietly, whereas ordinary users are banned by an automated system with no appeal. It's one more arena where the 1% play by a different set of rules. The carceral web, binding the many. Nowhere is the binding force of law on the 99% more literal than in the phenomenon often called the prison industrial complex. The United States offers a stark example. With about 5% of the world's population, the U.S. holds 20 to 25% of the world's incarcerated people. This didn't happen by accident, but through a series of legal and policy choices that created new crimes, imposed harsher sentences, and built a sprawling incarceration industry. Since 1970, the U.S. prison population exploded from around 200,000 inmates to 2.2 million today. Who are these millions? Disproportionately, They are the poor, racial minorities, the mentally ill, and the addicted, those left behind by the so-called free market. Mass incarceration is the ultimate expression of being bound by the law without being protected by it. For communities of color, policing and imprisonment have been wielded like instruments of social control, a harsh answer to social problems like poverty and drug abuse that might better be addressed by investment and treatment. Instead, we built a system that literally binds bodies in chains and cages. And it is a profitable system. Private prison corporations and countless vendors of prison services, phone calls, commissary, bail bonds, make money from keeping people locked up. The more prisoners, the higher the revenues. Thus, a perverse incentive. The law is written and lobbied to criminalize broadly and sentence severely. When tough-on-crime legislation like mandatory minimum sentences or three-strikes laws pass, they fill the cells that fill corporate pockets. Meanwhile, those same laws rarely ensnare elite wrongdoers. Bankers who launder money for drug cartels, activity that directly contributes to street violence, pay fines. But a low-level drug seller faces decades behind bars. It is hard to imagine a more literal illustration of law as shield versus law as shackle. The war on drugs, for instance, has been called a war on the poor. Possession of a small amount of crack cocaine, more prevalent in poor communities, was punished for decades far more harshly than an equivalent amount of powder cocaine, the Wall Street banker's vice. While countless individuals from impoverished neighborhoods were bound by draconian drug laws, serving long sentences for nonviolent offenses, the purveyors of the opioid epidemic in corporate boardrooms walked free after paying fines. The Sackler family, owners of Purdue Pharma, enriched themselves by aggressively pushing OxyContin, fueling a crisis that killed hundreds of thousands, yet they have largely avoided criminal accountability, protected by legal settlements. Contrast that with the person addicted to those very opioids, who might be arrested for possession or driven to theft to support a habit, and then jailed. The law's net scoops up the small players and users in mass, while the big players, the real engineers of the crisis, maneuver behind legal firewalls. Even after one has paid their debt to society, the binding power of law persists in unequal ways. A wealthy person convicted of a crime can often reintegrate, their record perhaps scrubbed by expensive lawyers, or simply cushioned by their social connections and reputation management. A poor person with a felony record, however, may be unemployable, denied public housing, barred from voting. They carry the scarlet letter of former inmate forever, effectively exiled from full citizenship. Laws that disenfranchise felons end up disenfranchising huge swaths of black and brown voters in the U.S., tilting political power further toward the largely white and affluent. It's another feedback loop. Those most bound by law, ex-prisoners, have little voice in changing those laws precisely because of their status. Their interests go unprotected in the halls of policymaking, perpetuating a cycle of neglect and punishment. Resisting the paradox. Cracks in the edifice. Is this two-tier justice an inevitable feature of civilization, or can it be undone? History gives us examples of progress. Civil rights movements, labor movements, decolonization, all sought to rewrite the laws to better protect the many, not just the few. Each was a battle to force the law to live up to its ideals. The U.S. Civil Rights Movement, for instance, achieved legal victories that formally outlawed segregation and voting discrimination, attempting to extend legal protection to groups long excluded. Yet, as Martin Luther King Jr. lamented late in his life, winning the right to sit at a lunch counter didn't change the fact that one might not afford the meal. Economic justice remained elusive. And indeed, new forms of exclusion emerged. Mass incarceration has been dubbed the new Jim Crow for how it disproportionately locks up Black Americans and strips away rights. Nonetheless, these movements prove that law is not static. It can be bent toward justice by collective struggle. One can imagine futures where the aphorism no longer holds, utopian scenarios or at least improvements. Envision a society of true equal justice, robust public defenders, and legal aid such that rich and poor go to court on an equal footing. Campaign finance reform and lobbying restrictions that break the grip of oligarchic interests on lawmaking. Corporate crimes punished on par with street crimes. Imagine CEOs imprisoned for pollution deaths or financial fraud as readily as a mugger is imprisoned for robbery. Surveillance technologies governed by strict privacy laws that protect citizens from both corporate and state intrusion. A social safety net so strong that poverty is reduced, thereby shrinking the need for punitive policing. In such a society, the law's shield would extend over all. Universal health care, housing rights, and education guaranteed by law. And its binding chains, criminal enforcement, would be used sparingly and fairly, with an eye toward rehabilitation rather than sheer retribution. Alternatively, dystopian and cautionary tales abound if we fail to correct course. We could drift further into what some call neo-feudalism, where wealth inequality becomes so extreme that the rich literally secede from the common society. Private cities or seasteading colonies for billionaires could emerge, where they make their own laws and are accountable to none. The 99% might be left in decaying nation-states with authoritarian rulers, where law and order rhetoric justifies constant surveillance and crackdowns to keep the desperate populace in line. Technology could amplify tyranny, perhaps a future where dissenters are identified by AI and preemptively detained, where one's biometric data becomes one's shackle. No travel, no transactions without permission. In such a dark future, the aphorism might need amendment. The bottom 99% are bound within the law and also by it, imprisoned by an all-encompassing legal matrix, while the top 1% live entirely beyond those walls, in self-governed enclaves orbiting above any law. This is the stuff of dystopian science fiction, yet it extrapolates from trends already in motion: the privatization of everything, the retreat of elites into protected bubbles. Think luxury disaster bunkers and island hideaways. The use of advanced tech to monitor workers and citizens. The law as paradox and revelation. Ultimately, the aphorism, protected by the law but not bound by it, bound by the law but not protected by it, is a provocation to rethink what law is. Is law a tool of justice or just a tool of power? Perhaps it is, uncomfortably, both. We live in the tension between law's promise and law's reality. On one hand, we inherit philosophical and religious traditions that insist law ought to secure justice, to defend the weak, to curb the mighty. On the other hand, our lived social reality shows law as an instrument the mighty use to secure their position, a language in which power dresses itself to look respectable. This tension is not easily resolved. Even the most progressive laws can be co-opted or unevenly applied. Yet awareness of the paradox is the first step to changing it. The eclectic voices we have invoked, from Marx's fiery critique to Baldwin's poignant testimony, from Foucault's analytic gaze to Augustine's moral clarity, all point to a common understanding. When law serves only the elite, it loses its essence. The measure of a society's justice is not in how it treats its billionaires or princes, who will be fine regardless, but in how it protects its paupers, its pariahs, and every ordinary person. The rule of law, as idealized, means that the same rules constrain the president and the pauper, and the same rights shield them. If reality falls short, it is a call to action, and action can take many forms. It might be radical reform, breaking up concentrations of wealth and power that subvert the law's fairness. It might be building new institutions, community legal clinics, restorative justice programs, citizen oversight of police, participatory budgeting to give the public more say in lawmaking priorities. It might even be acts of civil disobedience in the spirit of Thoreau, Gandhi, and King, deliberately breaking unjust laws to awaken society's conscience. For if an unjust law is no law at all, then the bottom 99% refusing to be bound by laws that do not protect them could be seen as an assertion of humanity's higher law. The aphorism also invites us to an inner reflection. In what ways do we, perhaps unknowingly, contribute to this system? Do we take for granted protections that others lack? Do we avert our eyes when the vulnerable are trampled by legal processes because it's legal? It challenges the complacency of the comfortable. A middle-class professional might think the law works fine until they see through the eyes of someone on the margins. Empathy and solidarity can erode the psychological distance that allows two legal realities to persist. After all, the wealthiest 1% depends on a tacit social acceptance by a good chunk of the 99% that this is just the way things are. But once the illusion is dispelled, once more people see the cold monster behind the state's proclamations, or see the strings by which the powerful maneuver the law, then pressure builds for genuine change. In a poetic sense, law can be seen as a story a society tells about fairness. Right now, that story is deeply conflicted and riddled with irony. We have gilded constitutions and bills of rights proclaiming equality, alongside prisons and slums that testify to extreme inequality. It is a Kafkaesque plot indeed, at times darkly comic, at times outright tragic. Yet, unlike a static novel, this is a story still being written. We are the authors and the audience. Through democratic action, moral imagination, and perhaps a dash of utopian dreaming, we can rewrite the ending. Let us, then, imagine an outside-the-box takeaway. The law, to regain its legitimacy, must become bidirectional in its force, binding the powerful and protecting the powerless. Imagine a world where corruption by the rich is punished swiftly and severely, where no one is above the law's constraints, and a world where poverty, sickness, and vulnerability are not punished, but rather guarded by legal rights to welfare and dignity. This would be a reversal of the current aphorism, a world in which the wealthiest 1% are bound by the law, no loopholes, no impunity, and the bottom 99% are protected by the law, no exclusion, no neglect. A fantasy? Perhaps, but all progress starts as a fantasy of the oppressed. In closing, the aphorism at hand is both a diagnosis and a challenge. It strips away the sugar-coating from the idea of equal justice under law to show the skeletal truth of a system rigged in favor of a few. But it also demands that we do not stop at cynical acceptance. The very act of articulating this inequality is an act of hope. Hope that by naming the injustice, we can begin to unmake it. The law is man-made. It can be remade. The wealthy are few, the masses many. If the bottom 99% ever unite in saying no to laws that oppress, and yes to laws that liberate, the paradigm would shift. In the words of James Baldwin, "The moment we cease to hold each other, the sea engulfs us, and the light goes out." The law should be one of the ways we hold each other, rich and poor alike, in a common bond of society, not an ocean that drowns some and buoys others. To achieve that, We must shake off the passivity of being merely bound and insist that the law live up to its higher calling as protector. Only then can the law's shield cover all of us, and its shackles bind only the forces of true injustice. Sources: Galloway, Scott. Prof. G. Podcast, 2023, On the Wealthy and Law, France, Anatole. The Red Lily, 1894. Majestic Equality, quote. Marx, Karl and Engels, Friedrich, The Communist Manifesto, 1848. On Bourgeois Law. Orwell, George, Animal Farm, 1945. More Equal Than Others, Commandment. Nietzsche, Friedrich. Thus Spoke Zarathustra, 1883. The State as Coldest Monster. Foucault, Michel. Discipline and Punish, 1975. Panopticon and Power. Arendt, Hannah. The Origins of Totalitarianism, 1951. Right to Have Rights, as cited. Augustine of Hippo. On Free Choice of the Will, Shaber 387 AD. Unjust Law, quote. Baldwin, James. No Name in the Street, 1972. On the Unprotected and Justice, Piketty, Thomas. Capital in the 21st Century, 2014. Data on Top 1% Wealth. Oxfam International Report. Survival of the Richest, 2023. New Wealth to Top 1%. New Yorker. Why Corrupt Bankers Avoid Jail, 2017. Too Big to Jail Cases. Zuboff, Shoshana. The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, 2019. On Data as Raw Material. Equal Justice Initiative, Criminal Justice Reform, 2019. U.S. Incarceration Stats.